So everybody is hyped about it, and so I had to talk about this. We're talking about signals. Signals is something that SolidJS introduced, but it was there before even that. I believe it was in Knockout.js, but then it eventually made it to SolidJS, then Preact and React had some implementations, and now Angular basically implemented their first version, or not even the stable version, but their first implementation of signals, which is supposedly a really good reactive paradigm of how we manage state, or even how we want to notify different places within the code if something changes. Now, we have used observables for this in the past, so why do we really need something new? The main thing that Angular team has been pushing for quite a while is basically getting rid of zones or zone.js. Now, zone.js is a third-party library which Angular uses to work with the change detection, because we need to know if someone clicked something, because the components really can't know if something changed within the component until the user clicks, or there's an input, or there's an API call, or if you're using something like set timeout or set interval. So zone.js works with Angular by monkey patching all of these events, and then we also have RxJS. So if we get rid of zones, that means we have a better change detection that we can work with, and signals might actually make it possible. So in this video, we are going to work with signals. We have an application already, and we are going to see how we can use signals to work with the app. If you don't know who I am, I'm a Google developers expert in Angular for the past 5 years. I'm also the author of the Angular cookbook, which is right here, and I'm working on the second edition of it, which is gonna come this year. So please stay tuned. Now, without further ado, let's get started. So this is the app that we are working with. We have an Angular wishlist application with signals. I'm using Tailwind CSS for the UI. What we have so far is essentially a list of wishlist items, and I can actually mark them done or undone in this particular case, and you can see that I can see the number of items that have been done, but it's not reflected yet because we are going to work on it. But I can also go ahead and type something, and if I hit add, nothing really happens. The form is reset. But if I go to the console, I see the object that is just created with the text that I provided for this new wishlist item. So if I go to the code, this is what it looks like. So we have essentially an app that uses standalone components. For example, the app is bootstrapped with the app component, and the app component itself is a standalone component. So we don't have any modules in here. Same goes for the other components. So within the application, what we do, or within the app component, we use the wishlist component. If I go to the wishlist component, we see a couple of things. So in the wishlist component here, you will see that we have a heading, we have a form, and then we have also the count of done versus undone. And then we also have the wishlist item. Now I could go and show the code, but there's a better way. If you Google Angular developer tools, you can actually find the Chrome extension, and here you can install it to actually see the component tree just like this. So you can see we have the root, we have the wishlist component. Inside here we have the form, and then we have a bunch of wishlist items that you can see, and I can also go and see what properties do they have. For example, the first wishlist item, which is right now shown at the bottom, because it's marked done, has the item property just like this. We have a done, we have an ID, and here we have the text as in Angular cookbook. Now within the wishlist component, as you saw, we are running a loop over the wishlist array, and we basically have all these items that we show on the UI. Now, apart from that, we also have these components like the new wishlist form, which is an HTML form with a text area and a button. And if I go to the logic, then we have a function that essentially just creates this new item and then logs it. It does nothing else apart from just, resetting the form. Then if I go to the wishlist item component, it is mostly a presentational component. So here you can see an article with a text and a checkbox. And if you see the UI, you can see the text and the checkbox right here. So you can mark them as done or not done. And then if I go to the components TypeScript file, and here you can see a bunch of bindings, but the main one I want you to look at is this item click. So if I click on the host element, which is if I click on any wishlist item, it essentially changes the done to its reverse value, so either true or false in this particular case when I click it or when I toggle it. Now we are not using any signals or any state management tool whatsoever. The question is, where does this data come from, what we see, the wishlist items? So I have a constants file here, which is right here, so dummy data, and this is what we see. So first of all, what I want to do is to create a signal that contains this value. Right now, if I go to my wishlist component, here you can see that we are directly assigning the value of that constant to the wishlist array, and then we loop over that array to pass all the items into the wishlist item, and wishlist item basically renders them. So the first thing I would want to do essentially is not to have this array hard-coded or not provided like here, but rather from a signal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the terminal, and what I would do is essentially I would create a new service. So I would say ng service, and here I would name it wishlist. And that's pretty much it. So when we have this created, I'm going to go to this and then I'm going to create an array here. So I could say something like wishlist array, just like this. And here what I would do now is create a signal. So I'm going to use the signal method from Angular core, and then this requires an initial value so you can provide it. What I'm going to provide here is the dummy wishlist array. So I'm providing the array here in this case, and now I should be able to access this. What is this really? It's a settable signal. So if you mouse over, you can see this is a settable signal that I can use anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just save this file, and then I'm going to go to the wishlist component where I still have this dummy wishlist array hard-coded here. So instead of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go and inject my service here. So I'm going to say wishlist service or WS service equals inject, and in here I can provide the wish list service just like this, and in here I can now say this dot, and in here I can now say wish list array or wish list service, and then here dot WL array. So this is essentially assigning the settable signal to this wish list array. So this here is essentially a signal. So what I can do now that I have this, I can go into the template, and in here, instead of using it like this, because now this is not an array, it's a signal. So I have to use the method just like this. So just those parentheses. And when I do this, I actually get the array, and then everything should be working fine. So if I save this now and go to my UI, let's see what happens if I refresh now. It says WL array does not exist on wishlist service. Let's try this again. So it seems like if I go back to my service, I have WL array here. I'm going to save this, make sure that it compiles successfully. It does. And now if I go to my app without changing anything, you can see it works. So something was off there. But with the same code that I just showed you, it works. You can see that I have all the list of wishlist items here. I can mark them done or undone as before, so everything is working. All we changed was just the array not being in the wishlist component and rather being in the service as a signal. Now what I want to do is to be able to add items to this wishlist array. So I'm going to go to my new wishlist form, and in here, after I'm logging this new item, I could actually use the wishlist service here as well. So I would say WL service here, and here same thing, inject wishlist service. We're going to be working this in almost every component. And now that we have this service, I'm going to, after this log, say something like this dot WL service dot WL array. And in here, I can use the set method. The set method essentially sets the new value for this signal, and anywhere this signal is being used, it's going to get the updated value. In our case, we actually have the value being used here in the template, just like this. And since we are using it here, it's going to re-render this whole list based on the new value. So what I'm going to do is here, I'm going to say, hey, set the value of this WL array, which is in the signal, to what? To actually an array that contains all the value from the array, but then pushing the new item on top of it. So we're going to be saying, all right, first we see the new item that we just created, and then the rest of the array. So it creates a new value for it. This is a really good way of setting a new value because this is immutable. So what we are trying to do here is we are creating a new array instead of modifying the original one. Now signals do not require you to do that. You can actually update the same value or get the same array and push to it and then set it. It doesn't really matter, but it's good to use this approach that whenever you're setting a new value for an array, it is done in this way by creating a new array rather than modifying the existing one. So now I'm going to save this and let's see if it works. So if I go back to my browser and I say something new, let's see what happens. If I click add, there you go. You can see that I got something new here. I can also see that I got a new wishlist item. If I click this, am I able to see the item? Yes, you can see something new here, and you can see the new ID that we just created and also the done set to false. So I am able to actually add more items to it. The only problem I have right now is that this changed. So I think something messed up here, but We'll talk about that in a bit. So the first thing I would want to do now is if I go to my wishlist component here, you're going to see that here we are still using wishlist array like this and not with the method, which means that the length doesn't count in this case. So I'm going to use the method here to see if that fixes the UI to some extent. So I'm going to save this. And now in the UI, you can see that it shows the value correctly for the wishlist item. So if I go here and say something like new and hit enter, it would not do anything because this is a text area. But if I hit add here, you can see that here the length is shown correctly. If I add more, it would change as well. But this value here, this does not get updated because if I mark anything like this, you can see that this doesn't really work. And that is because we have not worked upon that yet. So if I go to my code, what do I use here? Exactly. I use something called finished count, which should basically be, hey, how many items from this array are finished? And I could go into my code here and I could do that in the ng-on-init. So I could do something like, hey, can I do something like this dot finish count equals this dot, I could say something like wishlist array, which is essentially a signal. So I could say, hey, get the value of the signal like this, and then you can do a filter. So you could do something like a filter, and in here you can say item. And then here you could do something like, hey, how many items are done? So you could say something like item dot done. And then here you can do something like dot length. So this will give us a finish count. Would that work? Let's see. Now, if I come here, you can see the initial value is absolutely correct because the dummy data has this one set to true. So now if I refresh, you can see it works pretty well. If I change something, does that reflect it? No. Why? Because this only happens or triggers once when we do ng-on-init, because that's what we are doing. We are saying, hey, get the actual array, filter it, and give it the value of the length. But this variable, which is essentially a number, is only set when this code is executed once. If anything changes within this array, this variable will not be changed because we are not doing anything or there's no mechanism to do so. Now, if I wanted to handle it in the traditional way, I would have to go and put this logic or update this finish count somehow whenever I'm adding an item or whenever I'm marking any item as done in this particular case. But this would not be helpful in this case. So first of all, what I would want to do is I would want to make this a computed property. So what I would want to do is in this particular case, I'm going to actually cut all of this. And in here, I'm going to say something like computed. If I say computed from Angular core, this is essentially the computed function for signals, which takes a callback, and inside here, you can return a value. So I could do something like return and this. Now you will notice that this is red, and that is because we are saying that this finish count is a number. But what this basically returns from computed is essentially a signal. So there's a difference between that. So I can't really have this set to 0 in the beginning now. So I could do something like colon, and here I would say something like a signal. Now that we have this, I could also say signal of number. And that would make it happy because you can see that this computed basically sends back a signal of number, and that is the type that we have here as well. Now that this finish count is a signal, I can't use it in here like this. I would have to use it like a signal. So I would have to use the parentheses to actually get the value. Let's save this and try this out. So now if I try to mark anything, no, it doesn't really work still. Why? Because this value is computed if this wishlist array signal changes. But the thing is, whenever we mark something done or not, which happens inside the wishlist item component, we just change the actual item. We don't change the array, the signal itself. So instead of doing this, we would have to actually change the array. So what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to inject the wishlist service here. So I'm going to say wishlist service, inject, and here I could say wishlist service. And then here, what I would do is I would go here and say, all right, this dot wishlist service dot wishlist array has to be set to what exactly? I'm going to actually copy this, and then I'm going to say something like, hey, give this a new array. And in here, you're going to map through this whole array. And then what would you do? When you find an item, you see if this particular item is the current item. And if that's the case, then you switch the done value. Otherwise, you don't. So I could say something like if here item or item.id equals this.item.id, then we do something or we switch done value. If that's not the case, then we just return the item in this case, okay? And this item means no change to the wishlist array item. So when this is the case, we could say return, and we can say dot 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 item. So everything that the item has, but the done value changes. So I would say something like done is set to not item dot done. So this is going to be, hey, if it was true, then set it to false. If it was false, set it to true. I can remove this comment as well. So now we are actually updating the wishlist array signal, and the value basically becomes a changed array that has the items done value swapped. I don't need this now because it would automatically reflect. Now that I have this, let's check this out. So now if I try to click this, boom, there you go. You can see that it automatically updates the value of this computed, because you could go and actually check this out. So if I go to sources, and if I go to the new wishlist form component, not the new one, but the wishlist item component, and in here, if I go and put a breakpoint right here, and then I also go to, for example, the wishlist.component.ts, and in here I go and put a breakpoint here in the computed one, then let's see what happens. As soon as I mark this one undone, you're going to see that we came into the item click. So we are now changing the value in the array, and I'm going to just put it here. So we changed this Angular Cookbook 2nd edition. So if I hit play, you're going to see that the match that we get is this item with the Angular Cookbook 2nd edition. And this dot item is also Angular Cookbook 2nd edition. So it flips the done, which was previously true, to now false. And as soon as that happens, our computed gets triggered. And since this is triggered, now it's going to filter out with the new value. So it's going to say, all right, not 2 out of 3 is done, but 1 out of 3 is done. So if I just move this forward, you can see that this changes to 1 out of 3 done. And you can basically work with this and check this out as much you want. But you can see that now, if I try something here, hit add, something more, this value is up to date, but then also these values are up to date as well. So now we have learned how to get a computed value from a signal. The important thing to learn here is that the computed function or the computed value will be computed whenever any signal inside this callback would change. So it doesn't matter which signal you're using, it's so magical that if you just put it inside this function, or your computed value basically depends on a signal, whenever the signal changes, the computed value changes, which basically makes sense. So now that we have learned how to basically get a value from a signal, how to set a value in a signal, and how the computed value works, we're going to talk about something cool called effect. And an effect is something that you use for side effects. So if you want to make an API call, if you want to save things to local storage, you would use an effect. Now the thing here is that if I want to say, all right, whenever anything changes in a particular signal, please save it to the local storage, how would I do it? In this particular case, I would actually go to the service and do it there. So what I will do here is I would say, all right, I have a, for example, saver, you could say local storage or ls saver, and that is going to be an effect. So here you could say something like use an effect, just like this. And this also takes a callback. So in this one, you're going to make it a callback. And the fun part is that if you put any statement here that do this or do that, and it's based on a signal, this effect would trigger anytime that signal changes. So if I just want to say here, save this wishes array to the local storage, the magic would become so that whenever this wishes array changes, the local storage or this whole block would trigger again. So I don't have to worry at all from where it changes. Whenever there is a change in this signal, I would save that to local storage, and that's so magical because that's what I want. So in this case, I would say something like local storage dot set item. Here you could say something like ng wishlist in this case, and then the value that I want to store or save in local storage has to be a stringified version of this wishes array. So I would say something like json.stringify in this case, and here I could go and say something like this dot wishlist array, and then just this. So I'm stringifying the whole array, and then I'm saving it into the local storage with the name of ng wishlist. So I'm just going to save this and let's see what happens. So if I refresh the application, and if I just go to the application here and go to local storage, you can already see that we have this ng wishlist, and it has all the 3 items that you can see here. And now the fun part is that if I change anything at all it will be saved into the local storage. For example, if I add something new and hit add, you see it just came here in the local storage, and this is the one that I just added. Even if you try to mark something as done or not, because we are changing the signals, it updates the UI, it updates the computed value, and it also saves everything to the local storage. So if I mark this one as done, see here, if I click this, the done here is true. If I unmark it, you can see that now the done is false for the same text. So it automatically saves that, it reflects on the UI, everything is working perfectly. The only problem right now here is if I refresh the application, this sets itself to the dummy data because my code is written as such. So let's quickly fix that. So I'm going to go to my service, and in here, while I'm saying, all right, the wishlist array is going to be the dummy wishlist, I would rather say if I have something in the local storage, use that. Otherwise, use the dummy wishlist array. So I could go here and say this dot, or I could say something like const here. I could say const wishlist items or items from storage equals, and I can say something like this dot get items from storage. And I need to create that function. So I'm going to say, I'm going to just copy this, paste it here, and then I'm going to say return. And in here, I could say something like items string. So I'm going to first see if there are items in the local storage. So I can say items str equals local storage. I have to use the same key ng wishlist in order to retrieve the items. So I could say something like local storage dot get item. And in here, I could say ng wishlist just like this. And then I can say, hey, if I have the item str, then I would do json.parse items str. Otherwise, I would just return back this dummy wishlist array by default. So now I could say something like get items from storage, which is returning here. And then I would say something like this dot wl array or wishlist array equals signal. And here I can say items from storage. So I can actually remove this one, but I'm going to sort of just define that this is going to be of a type settable signal. So a settable signal type of wishlist item array. So I'm going to actually give this a type just like this. So here, and then that's that. And then I'm going to just import all the missing imports. So we got settable signal, wishlist item, and everything looks good. So I'm going to just save this now. So if I refresh now, you can see that I get the dummy data right now. But if I go to sources and if I go to, for example, wishlist service, let's see if our logic works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a breakpoint here and then here. So let's add something, hit add. And if I refresh now, it's going to come here. I'm going to try to get the items from storage. You can see that inside the application, we have 4 items, not the 3 default one. So I have this custom one added here as well. So it's going to find the item string just like this, and then it's going to return the parsed array like this. So now we've got an array of 4 items, and now it's actually going to set that to the signal. So we render 4 items, not 3. And you can see that all the numbers are good. Everything looks good here. I can mark things just like this. I could add actually more stuff just like this. And then if I refresh, everything persists because our code works like that. So you can see one of the really good things about this is if I go to the Angular dev tools here, we have the app wishlist and then a lot of wishlist items, and then we have the wishlist form as well. The great thing here is that there's no output communication here that a component has to put the value out to the parent and the parent then has to do something. We have a signal within the wishlist service that does everything, and everywhere we're using signals. So I'm really excited for this, even though this is in the early phases. I'm really excited on how this is going to go forward and make this like seamless experience. One of the questions that I have is how this is going to affect, for example, observables or the input outputs, because there were a lot of questions about inputs being observables by default. So having those signals there, one of the things that we know is that we're going to have some API to convert observables into signals, and also the other way around. So signals to observables so you can work with them. And I'm going to be really excited to actually see this with Angular forms and whatnot. So you can also tell me, what do you think about signals so far? Did you like this video? Did you get to learn a lot about signals, especially in the context of Angular? And are you hyped about signals as the other developers are? Just let me know in the comments. And as always, happy coding. I'm going to see you in the next video.